Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us today, and we really do have a special feature for you. We're here to discuss an important new book that's come out of Oxford University Press, that is Terrorism, Politics and Human Rights Advocacy, the Bring Back Our Girls movement. And we're particularly lucky because we have two people here to discuss it. One, of course, is the author, Temitope Oriola, a professor of criminology and sociology at the University of Alberta and currently Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at Leipzig University in Germany. And also Bonny, who's here today as a professor of human rights at McMaster University and the United Nations independent expert on the right to development. I will be offering some interesting thoughts, critiques, suggestions on the book. But first, I think, of course, Professor Oriola, we really need to hear from you. Why did you write the book? What are the key arguments of the book? What would you like the people, who are watching us today to kind of take home as the key message? And then we'll get into the discussion. So first of all, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you, Bonny, for joining us. And both of you, you may or may not be aware of this, played huge roles in this. Bonny read one of the initial drafts of the manuscript before it went to Oxford University Press, and Nick, of course, was the editor of the series that published the book. So both of you played major roles in the production of this book, and I want to say a huge thank you to both of you. So the impetus to write this book came from my observations of Boko Haram's atrocities in East Nigeria and subsequently across the West African sub-region. I had initially started out to write a book on Boko Haram, and began a participant observational research. I became embedded within the Bring Back Our Girls movement in Abuja, Nigeria's capital, in the summer of 2015. I did that for 3 years, so each summer from 2015 to 2017. And as I was embedded in this movement, I was enthralled by the phenomenon that I was observing, and decided that this was a more fascinating social phenomenon to study and focus on than Boko Haram. So I wrote several refereed articles on Boko Haram, but ended up doing the book on the Bring Back Our Girls movement. Now, the Bring Back Our Girls movement, for those who may not be aware, is a women-led human rights advocacy group. As I argue in the book, it is, to all intents and purposes, a global leader in lives matter politics. And as a participant observer across 3 summers, I saw the intricate and complex work that the movement was engaged in both in terms of how it organized its members for protest and in communicating with external stakeholders. The book, therefore, is an insider-outsider analysis of the Bring Back Our Girls movement. I argue that this movement is a ruthlessly efficient ideational machinery for socio-political change, and I will explain why in a moment. This is an elite and middle-class coalition in Nigeria and around the world. And of course, while the Bring Back Our Girls movement is famous for its deployment of the social media for its objectives and mobilization and so forth, I argue in the book that in reality, the Bring Back Our Girls movement adopts a hybridized approach, which combines social and traditional media, contrary to a lot of scholarly and lay discussions on the Bring Back Our Girls movement. The movement has been quite meticulous. I argue, it has engaged its various stakeholders, and I found that movement actors were in fact bemused by the presupposition that they somehow quite easily walked into international limelight. There was in fact a lot more complicated and painstaking effort that went into what the Bring Back Our Girls movement became. It's a global icon that various global leaders identified with, particularly at the height of its mobilization in 2014 and 2015. And much, or at least a part of the book, is devoted to how the Bring Back Our Girls movement turned the Chibok kidnapping, the kidnapping of nearly 300 high school girls in Northeast Nigeria in April of 2014, into a social problem in a sociological, theoretical sense. And the idea behind that is that not every bad condition that affects people automatically becomes a social problem. There are all kinds of debilitating conditions affecting people in different parts of the world, but not all of those social problems in a sociological sense. There is a process, a social, political, and even cultural and organizational process in the evolution of a bad social condition affecting a crop of people into a social problem in a sociological sense. And in considering how the Bring Back Our Girls movement was able to do that, and in other words, that transformation, I proposed what I call a contextual seven-stage model in the development of a social problem and a probable social problem industry. So not all bad conditions become social problems in a sociological sense, but not, and by the same token, not all social problems acquire an industry. But in the case of the Chibok kidnapping, I argue that the social problem industry was in fact crafted inadvertently through the activities of the Bring Back Our Girls movement. Now, the stages of this model that I analyze and propose in my book include the overpass stage, elite mobilization, the validation stage, governing authority response stage, the bifurcated trajectory stage, internationalization stage, and the denouement stage as well. I'm happy to say more about each of these when we get to the Q&A. The book also speaks to the internationalization of the framing of the Bring Back Our Girls movement and the consequences of that. I analyze and identify 4 major master framing techniques deployed by the Bring Back Our Girls movement. These include the Motherist or maternal master frame, the Girls' Right to Education master frame, the Human Rights frame, as well as the State Failure master frame. Or each one of these has consequences for the evolution of the movement and the outcomes of the movement. But overall, I argue that the earlier stages of the movement mobilization were dominated by a Motherist or maternalist master frame. But over time, as it became clear that the rescue by the Nigerian state was not forthcoming, movement activists began to focus on the degeneracy of the state and in other words, state failure. And again, that had an effect on the movement context and environment, essentially alienating the institutional sovereigns within the Nigerian society and made collaboration with the military elite in particular almost impossible. I also argue that despite the incredible intellectual work which I saw firsthand while conducting field work that was done by the movement activists, they seem to have put too much trust and confidence in the engagement and intervention of Western states. Now, that has implications for some of the conclusions that I draw in the book. Now, of course, this also has implications for grassroots movements in the global South, and I speak to the need to work with institutional sovereigns in the various local contexts because external intervention can be unpredictable and is often attenuated by various national and geopolitical interests. The book also focuses on state repression against the Bring Back Our Girls movement and how movement leaders tackled issues in addition to state repression, things like arrests on trumped-up charges, bomb threats, and sponsorship of chaos in the movement, and an attempted leadership change within the movement. In other words, trying to use a few of the members to effect leadership change in the movement. The book also explores the relationship between the Bring Back Our Girls movement and the Nigerian military. Now, this was an interesting phenomenon because some of the leaders of the movement had worked at their highest levels of government. And so Dr. Obi Ezekwesili, for example, who it's generally viewed as the #1 leader of the movement, was in fact a two-time federal minister, and had acquired very strong reputation as a no-nonsense political leader. But that approach shaped the relationship with the military and invariably the political process and context within which the broader movement functioned. And so I argue in the book with evidence from field work how the relationship between the Bring Back Our Girls movement and the Nigerian military evolved from one of collaboration and mutual trust to one of mutual suspicion and animosity. But beyond all of that, the book also demonstrates the significant impact of the Bring Back Our Girls movement on other advocacy groups in Nigeria and across Africa. And I speak to the End SARS movement, for example, Enough is Enough, and so on and so forth. These are advocacy groups that have drawn fairly significantly from some of the work that the Bring Back Our Girls movement, or BBOG for sure, was able to do. And of course, the effects of the Nigerian political process on the Bring Back Our Girls movement and the efforts to rescue the Chibok girls forms a huge part of what the book also looked at. In other words, the need for movement advocacy groups to be clear what their objectives are and what exactly can help them to achieve their objectives beyond clicking likes or sharing links to stories or press releases and so on and so forth. So part of what I found was that while there were political leaders around the world, including British Prime Minister, celebrities, Michelle Obama, and so on and so forth, all displaying the Bring Back Our Girls movement placards, in reality, not much was done to help with the rescue of the Chibok girls. And so for movements around the world, not just in the global South, it's important to be very clear what exactly does success look like? What exactly is the outcome that you're looking for? It's just providing information, just creating awareness about a social problem. Is that sufficient an outcome for you? Are there other things that you want other stakeholders, right, within or outside your particular social context to do or assist with doing? I think it's clear, or rather it's important to be clear about that. And it did seem that while there was significant global awareness about the Bring Back Our Girls movement, there was not a lot of attention paid to that step between mobilizing global opinions, generating awareness, and actually effecting the change that the BBOG was in fact seeking. The book goes into great detail about the outcomes of the Bring Back Our Girls movement. For instance, a negotiated release of over 100 of the girls who were kidnapped. And of course, the government's uncharacteristic devotion to the welfare of the Chibok girls. And of course, beyond its immediate constituency, though I also speak to the way the BBOG advanced the frontiers of nonviolent protest in Nigeria and across Africa. Now, part of the indirect but extremely significant outcome of the BBOG movement is, of course, the first electoral loss of an incumbent president in the annals of Nigeria. And the electoral loss of President Goodluck Jonathan, that was in part because of the mobilization of the BBOG and the non-rescue of the Chibok girls and what was perceived as a lackadaisical attitude by the government. This was a seismic change, albeit an indirect change, part of the broad outcomes of the Bring Back Our Girls movement. But as I wrap up and listen to my colleagues, it's important to emphasize that for activists in the global South in particular, one of the lessons that the book offers is to think local and act local. elites bring significant cultural and social capital, as well as organizational capacity to grassroots movements, but they also come with considerable baggage. But overall, the book does argue that the BBOG movement is a significant and highly consequential human rights advocacy, particularly in post-colonial Africa. Thank you, and back to you, moderator.
Fabulous. I've rarely seen someone give such a fluid overview of a book or do it quite so much justice in such a short space of time. That was very impressive. Thanks so much. And I think one of the things that really strikes me about the book is also the depth of the research, right? I think there's something like 170 interviews here, right, from different groups in different places, different types of members of society, in the military, people involved in the conflict, and then civil society and so on. That gives it a real breadth and depth that I think a lot of other studies on this topic, and I don't want to go too much into the discussants' comments here, but I think a lot of other studies on this topic have not always had that depth. They've often been attempts to kind of capitalize on, the fact that this is quite a high-profile issue, and it's really great to have a study that actually brings us so many different voices, so much depth of analysis. With that, Professor Ibhawoh, I will pass over to you and give you the floor for any questions, thoughts, critiques you might have, and also I think some of the sort of thoughts that perhaps it inspired for you in terms of how we might take these kinds of research agendas forwards.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, and thank you, Dr. for this invitation. Mine will be mostly comments and questions. First, I have to say that I really did enjoy reading this book. It came for me at the right time, and I'll explain why. But one can say a lot about the intellectual spaces in which this book intervenes. But I want to focus on four of them that are most relevant to me and I found most interesting and engaging. The four things are, the first, obviously, is the contribution that the book makes to our understanding of social movements. Not being a sociologist myself, I was fascinated by the notion of a social problem industry. And one of the questions I have for Dr. Oriola is to expand a bit on whether there is some form of normative commentary being made here about this industry and how the Bring Back Girls movement epitomized these social problem industry as he outlines. The second contribution that I find to this book is the contribution it makes to the discourse on peace and security in this region of Africa. And this is an area in which I'm directly involved now as the UN independent expert on the right to development, working with the Lake Chad Basin Commission on trying to develop a transitional justice framework for the region. So what this book does is that it provides some context to understanding the space and the debates that are happening both at the grassroots level and at the political and at a elite level. So the third contribution that I find, and I think this is more, actually this is for me the more interesting thing about this book, is what it says about elite. And Dr. Oriola, you make reference to Bayard's famous book, Francois Bayard's famous book on the belly thesis, and I like the reference you make somewhere in the book to the notion of stomach infrastructure. But the central theme here is the role of the elite in the post-colonial state, the notion of elite capture, the elites, the post-colonial African elites, appropriating resources that should be for the masses for their own self-indulgent interest. And that has been framed as elite capture. But here I see you do something a little bit nuanced with this whole notion of what I would call elite interventionism. These female elites who I wouldn't so much say capture the movement, but in some ways intervened in very creative way, and in some cases maybe appropriated some of these issues And I like the way you try to look at it beyond the whole notion of capture. That yes, it was elite women taking the reins, so to speak, and leading the movement. And to that extent, it advanced the cause. But like you just said, also came with baggage. And what does that mean? How does that kind of soften our classic understanding of elite capture? Perhaps there is elite capture, but in some other spaces, there might be a little bit more happening here in the way that the elites intervene in grassroots politics. You mentioned that some of the leaders of the Bring Back Our Girls movement were also former state officials. Who, going by some of the classic narratives about elite capture, will be seen as being right in the middle of the capture process. But what you're showing us is that in some other context, the narrative and the engagement between elites and grassroots movements, particularly social movements, transcends just the narrative of capture. It is a little bit more complicated. And I think that is a very, very useful insight in understanding the political dynamics of the post-colonial states. And in some ways, I would even argue, challenges some of the conventional wisdom in this space. And then finally, the point you make about lives matter politics. I'm always interested not just in the place of the world in Africa, but in the place of Africa in the world. And I think this is one that really resonates with me, because I think when we have studies like this, it is important to locate them in terms of what the narratives contribute to our understanding of global politics. So the Bring Back Our Girls movement was internationalized, but you argue in the book, rightly so, that it wasn't fully transnationalized. You locate it within the framework of an emerging lives matter politics. So you do a kind of internal comparative analysis, making reference to the Enough is Enough movement, the Occupy Nigeria movement. But you also do what I would call a transnational comparative analysis, because you're also, putting it alongside the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's interesting to me that you frame it in that way, because of course, as you know, the Black Lives Matter movement started off in the United States as a reaction to police brutality, was an attempt to assert the value of Black lives. And here we find that same trope being applied in the context. It makes me wonder whether there's something to be said about whose lives needs reaffirming, whose lives are in question, and what are the historical antecedents of that narrative about the need to reaffirm the value of the lives of certain communities and certain peoples around the world. Which brings me to my final point. As a legal historian myself, I understand and I appreciate, this is a point that Nick made earlier, the in-depth work that went into this research, very well grounded in historical context. Something we don't see very often these days. Analyses tend to be very presentist, focused on the here and now, damned be historical antecedents. But here we see you really connecting the dots, framing this within the context of colonial Nigerian politics, the politics of indirect rule, the politics of divide and rule, the post-colonial politics of resource contestation, and how this is not just a movement that emerged from the blue, but that was actually grounded in the historical conditions of the actors and stakeholders involved. So these are the key themes that I gravitated to as I read this very interesting book. I do have questions that I would like to ask, but I think I'll stop for now.
Prof, would you like to respond to some of those thoughts before we maybe encourage our distinguished discussant to come in with some questions as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Bonny, for your comments. And I absolutely, I'm biased here, but I really did like your comments. Now, I'll just touch on a few things that struck me as you were speaking. Your first point was on the social problem industry, and that I'm in fact making a normative comment around, and you're absolutely right, because as is now becoming increasingly clear, a lot of resources has in fact been devoted to that section of Nigeria, so Borno State, where this incident happened, and across the Northeast. And this is a combination and constellation of local, national, and international players and NGOs. But the reality, despite the billions of dollars that have been sunk in, is that there's not much to show for it. And that's not a political commentary. That's from just empirical investigation, from visiting the camps of the internally displaced persons. You look at what's been appropriated for the welfare of these individuals and what's actually on the ground. A former governor of Borno State, for example, became concerned at one point and asked publicly that NGOs should leave Borno State because they were not doing the work. And one of the most instructive aspects of his comment was that some NGOs were building essentially toilet facilities and were taking helicopter rides to inspect the toilet facilities. So in each of those rides, each of those trips was in fact more expensive than what they were building. And then he said that the people were being turned into cash cows, and there was a general alarm in the broader society when some NGOs, international NGOs I should mention, were taking out leases of a decade or longer, which meant that they were preparing to be there for the long haul. But then, in other words, the problem was not getting solved soon. That's the way this was read, and I thought these were all very didactic developments. And so that's there at sort of an empirical level. But at a theoretical level, much sociological theorizing on social problems and bad conditions I felt were overly unilinear in approach. So the unilinearism struck me because the presupposition was that if somehow once a bad condition got construed as a social problem, it would get solved. This was what much of the theorizing dating back to the 1950s indicated, and I thought that, well, that's not always true. It depends on the context. And hence, in the model that I presented, I spoke of bifurcation and governmental authority response. There were times when activists would simply get picked up for talking too much about a bad social condition. Arrests could follow, but they could also decide to set up a task force to deal with the problem. That may or may not become an end in and of itself. And so just being seen to be doing something rather than cogently addressing the problem. And so there was a disjuncture between what was existing in terms of sociological theorizing and social problems and what was on the ground in the Northeast and the post-colony in general. And I thought there was a need for alternate thinking and theorizing around the life cycles of social problems and the broader implications of some of these issues in illiberal and quasi-democratic and non-Western context. Now, of course, the elite aspect obviously is always fascinating. The general perception was that the likes of Dr. Obi Ezekwesili and others who were involved in the Bring Back Our Girls movement were committing a class suicide because they were repudiating their membership of that class. Now, keep in mind, Dr. Ezekwesili was vice president of the World Bank Africa, was a two-time federal minister, and all of that, but was somebody who led from the front in this advocacy leading street protests and so on and so forth. Now, that of course helped the movement in terms of its mobilization, media coverage, and so on and so forth. But of course, because she had served in a certain government with a certain political ideology, even though she was not necessarily a card-carrying member herself, and she was also surrounded by other women leaders who had in fact played very active parts and roles in partisan politics. Folks that ran for House of Reps or Senate and so on before movement mobilization, and were also in several cases involved actively in the opposition party while the movement mobilization was going on. And so all of this became an albatross around the Bring Back Our Girls movement. Now, and again, the role of elite is key, especially when you look at the interaction between the military elites and political elites and the broader political economy of that region and the entire country. In a piece that I wrote after this book, it was released. Obviously, books take longer to come out, but I wrote the manuscript after the book manuscript. This is published in the journal Armed Forces and Society. I propose what I call the civilian military leadership interest convergence thesis. Now, much theorizing in civil military relations tends to focus on control. Who's controlling the military and all of that. But my focus is on the dynamics of the relationship between military and political elites, as well as the direction of the military as an apparatus of the state. And then I argue about the backgrounds of the military and civilian elites, how existing theorizing on civil military relations were relevant if we're talking about Western context, but had relatively diminished relevance with all due respect to the incredible work that went into much of such theorizing when it came to the post-colony. And so one of the bureaucratic / organizational model, for instance, speaks to the fact that when you have a small war, the military might take a decision to end a small war ahead of political leaders when the legitimacy of the military was at stake. But in the context that I was looking at, in reality, that the legitimacy of the military did not seem to be much of a priority. And in fact, the imminent ruin of the state also did not seem to be of a huge priority. And so I theorized that and proposed this model around the way the realities in a post-colony played out. The fact that military leaders were not necessarily the best and the brightest amongst their peers. They were selected on the basis of ethno-religious loyalties and delicate balancing of power within the politics of the nations, of ethnic, religious considerations, and so on and so forth. So what you had were leaders that were products of compromise. And of course, in regions with a history of coups and counter-coups, you needed to choose folks that you trusted. And that meant what? He chose the kinsman or kinswoman to take over. And of course, there were lots of examples around that, but also the way that there seemed to be discursive symmetry between the political leaders and military leaders as the war, in fact, got worse. They began to coalesce around a similar set of speaking points, even though evidently the war was not going well. And so, so that role, I think, is an interesting one. That what I've just shared couldn't fit into the book, so I did a separate article which was published in Armed Forces and Society around the military and political leaders and the rapport between them and how that shaped the context. Again, drawing on the same data set, but just making a different set of arguments around the role of elites and proposing an alternative thinking around elite role in the post-colony. So the place of the Bring Back Our Girls movement, I believe, is assured in global lives matter politics. This is a movement that was incredibly sophisticated, a lot of intellectual work, which I witnessed, and some of it at least that I witnessed was clearly not part of the ST, the strategic team, but what was done at the sit-out, as they called it. I participated in those, interviewed a lot of the top leaders of the group, and some of them multiple times, just to get a sense of the thinking in the room when those key decisions were being made. And of course, what was immediately clear was that they did what was a great job under incredibly different circumstances. Now, of course, we have the benefit of hindsight and can look back and all of that, but they were making those decisions in the moment. And based on the evidence that they saw as it appeared before them. But clearly, a lot of those folks that I interviewed, especially around 2017 and in 2018 as well, were clear that at least some of them would have done things differently, especially in relation to working with the institutional sovereigns, the local and national elites. In other words, rather than speaking past the heads of the military elites or the national leaders and overemphasizing the state failure framing, that they would have worked with those individuals rather than expecting some kind of external intervention by global superpowers. And so there is, at the minimum, a recognition that that could have been done differently in terms of the discursive approach that they use, because they realize in hindsight that antagonized the national leaders. But they have made what was in that moment what would have appeared as very, very sound analysis, because there was a real risk of co-optation by the state, which was interested in absorbing them. And then, of course, the opposition party at the time, the APC, which is now the ruling party, and has been since 2015, was quick to try to align itself with the Bring Back Our Girls movement. So they were caught between this incredibly supercharged political atmosphere. But then there were lives of nearly 300 high school girls that were at stake. And the general consensus now, which has been building for a while, is that, well, on the one hand, the BBUG ensured that the lives of those girls mattered, that they were not simply forgotten and the society didn't simply move on, which was a distinct possibility given the history of Nigeria, and in particular, kidnappings, which had in fact started to become routine at that point. And some of the listeners may be aware that 2 months before the Chibok kidnapping, there were 59 high school boys who were massacred by Boko Haram in Yobe State, not too far from Borno State. But that did not quite generate a lot of attention. The society simply moved forward. So there was a sense that this was not going to be allowed to be one of those kinds of tragedies that needed to be more done. But on the other hand, the engagement, the internationalization of the framing of the BBUG contributed to the prolonged captivity of the girls. But as Dr. Ezekwesili put it, what was a counterfactual? What were they supposed to do? The idea was, by talking about them and fighting for them, protesting on their behalf, you could at least get some, if not all of them, back. And back to you, moderator.
Thanks so much for that. I just want to throw maybe one thought in, and then maybe, Bonny, come back to you for any final questions. The thought that struck me reading the book, and I think it's a really important piece of work, is what it says about identity politics, right? And it strikes me that one of the things that it tells us, which you guys both know, but I think is often overlooked by people from outside the continent, is the important interrelationship and inter-effect of multiple different identities, right? I mean, we could see this through a class lens. We could see this as about, people who are poorer being ignored, and lives mattering coming to take more of a class context and simply being a race. We could see it as being about ethnicity, as being about religion, about being about region, and being in the periphery of the state. There's multiple overlapping kind of forms of identity that need to be understood to actually understood the relationship between these girls and the government, and whether or not they would be seen as a priority outside of any of these campaigns. And I think that one of the things that I really like about the book is it brings out those different lenses, and it doesn't kind of pick one. It recognizes that all of them have something to tell us. And I think that also then tells us something quite important about African politics, which is the importance of not overlooking the importance of class or positionality or space when you start talking about things like, ethnicity or race, etc. Anyway, just a quick thought for me on one of the things that I hope that my own students reading the book will take out of it, because I think there's a lot of lessons in the book that go well beyond this particular example. But Bonny, coming to you for a final couple of questions, perhaps, and then Prof. Oriola, if it's okay, we'll come back to you for responses to those questions, and also finally, be interesting, I think, for our viewers to know where your research has gone next. You've already spoken about one of the things you've done since the book, but if there's any other areas of research that you're now pursuing, what you think maybe are some of our listeners who might be really interested, might be researching in this area themselves as early career researchers, where you think the gaps still are. Over to you, Bonny.
Thank you very much. Dr. Oriola, as you spoke, I was reminded of the saying, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That sometimes actors are well-intentioned, but the outcomes are sometimes not desirable. I also like the point you made about the counterfactual. What else could have been done under the circumstance? But I want to I would like to hear your thoughts on the broader legacies of these kinds of Africa-centered, what I'll call social problems of pain. Here I'm thinking about Coney 2012, thinking about other movements, about what you call the Lives Matter politics. What are the ultimate legacies? I mean, the big picture implications of this movement for politics in Africa, for narratives about Africa, for Africa's place in the world. Of course, in this case, the central theme is saving the lives of, 300 young girls who've been adopted and making sure they were brought back safely. And to that extent, we could say, well, the movement helped, but it also hurt the cause. But stepping back a bit, I would like to really hear from you what you think this says about how we understand politics in Africa, but like I said before, how the world sees Africa and how the world engages with Africa. In the case of the Bring Back Our Girls movement, you make the interesting point that the leaders of this movement, the Aisha Yusufus, the Kwesilis, were very keen to retain control of the narrative. They did not want it transnationalized. There was a very strong sense of not buying into the white savior, kind of trope or model. This was a movement owned, led by this group of, very strong and dedicated elite African women. Of course, I have to mention here that they were building on a long tradition of women's activism in this part of the world, whether you're going back to the Ibhawoh Women's War or you're going back to the activism of Funmilayo Ransome Kuti. Women have been at the forefront of political struggle against indigenous patriarchy and against colonial oppression. So in some ways, it wasn't new. But what I thought was interesting about this movement was, on the one hand, it kind of showed, and I've talked about the idea of going beyond the politics of elite capture to take a more nuanced view of how the elite engage in mass politics. But on one hand, there is this sense that it had to be internationalized for impact to happen. The government had to be embarrassed to jolt it out of its reverie, to get it to do something. So it was important to engage the international. But on the other hand, there's a strong sense of agency, of ownership, of ensuring that this is led by, the people, the elite women representing, of course, the people. And I want you to speak a bit to that dialectics and what it says about, one, an awareness of the broader political implications of ownership of these kinds of social problems, and how this was similar or different from previous movements. And, again, the legal historian in me, I could go back to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the civilized are no different from the savages, if you really boil it down. And so where do you place this in this long trajectory of narratives about Africa as a site of pain that need to be redressed from the outside?
Right. Thank you for that. And I think you've touched on an excellent number of things. The Kony 2012 obviously is an intriguing one, in part because of its origins and of course, the fact that it spoke to an issue where the country concerned was trying to move on from that, and it was a throwback or an atavistic kind of ideation, which took on a life of its own and generated such fervor and even governmental action in the States, which was not in sync with what folks wanted at that point in the affected region, in Uganda and so on and so forth. Now, but the Bring Back Our Girls movement is essentially a coming of age of women-led human rights advocacy movements on the African continent. And so, unlike some of its earlier predecessors, for example, if you want to, again, depending on how far back you want to go, whether that's Ibhawoh, Bordeaux, and nude protests, for example, being from even the rapporteurs of protest, there was a clear distinction in the kind of tactics and strategies that were adopted. But part of it, of course, was just the sheer might of the cultural and social capital of those involved. These were individuals who had studied at some of the very best institutions around the world, whether you're talking Harvard or ABU or Unilag, UI, and all of that. These were folks who had been there and done that. And so, of a necessity, their approach was going to be very different. But also in the post-colonial era, you had a shift away from state-organized NGO model movements that depended on governments for funding and all of that. So this was a movement that was very clear from the onset. They were not going to accept funding from any entity. Only members were permitted to fund the movement. And my understanding is they turned down funding opportunities nationally and internationally, mostly internationally. And, we really don't need a lot. We just need banners and flyers, and we could rent chairs, for our daily meetings and all of that. But other than that, they didn't need any funding. And of course, the incredible visibility of the leaders also ensured that traditional media organizations were drawn almost inexorably to this daily sit-out. For example, the Channels TV, one of Nigeria's leading private TV station, had staff stationed there on a daily basis. A number of newspapers had dedicated pages to the BDUG movement's activities at the height of mobilization. And of course, all of these things were shared and all of that. So it's a different kind of movement. It's a coming of age, and it builds on, but also presents a far more sophisticated version and iteration of earlier women-led movements on the African continent. Now, of course, this is an incredible issue of agency and an exercise of agency. It's supranational and yet locally embedded. Again, while the framing of the movement was internationalized, the movement did not seek formal institutional ties with international organizations. They were very conscientious about not doing that, again, to maintain that autonomy, that independence, so that their attention is not shifted elsewhere. And of course, there was a very clear recognition of the optics of it all. And then, of course, the focus of the movement, because the research around that is very clear. Over time, with those ties, comes a shift away towards the NGO model, in which case funders begin to dictate what exactly might become the priority of such a movement. So clearly they were able to identify that very, very early on in the movement in order to retain control and the trajectory and the destiny of the movements. I thought that was one aspect of it that was very, very well done and was not in any way accidental. They were aware of this and pursued that very rigorously. Back to you.
Great, thanks so much. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. I am sure that we have encouraged many people to go and buy the book. Remember, everyone, that this is a book you can purchase from Oxford University Press, but also, of course, all good bookstores. Very much thank you to Temitope and Bonny for being with us today. It's been a really interesting discussion. I think we've covered some great empirical ground, some great theoretical ground. So thank you very much. And I really look forward to having people who respond. And of course, if you do respond, if you do engage, if you do follow up with some of the book's key findings, if you go and do research on this yourself, please get in touch with Democracy in Africa, and we can also share that on the website. Okay, thanks, everyone. Real pleasure. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.